My name is Wesley Carver, and before everything fell apart, I believe I understood who I was and what my life meant. I was 36 years old at the time this story truly began, a senior logistics manager for a regional shipping firm that specialized in medical supplies. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was stable, demanding, and honest, qualities I built my identity around. I was the kind of man who showed up early, left late, paid his bills on time, and believed loyalty was a currency more valuable than money. I took pride in being dependable, in being the son my mother praised, the brother my family trusted, and the husband my wife claimed she prayed for. If you love ruthless revenge stories packed with shocking twists, like this video and subscribe now. New, never-before-seen stories are released here every day, each more intense than the last. I met my wife when I was 28 and she was 25 at a community fundraiser organized by a local hospital. She worked as a patient care coordinator then, the kind of job that made her seem compassionate and selfless, always talking about helping people during their most vulnerable moments. I remember noticing her laugh first, soft, practiced, and comforting, and then the way she listened, tilting her head slightly as if every word mattered. We talked for hours at night, about work, faith, family, and the futures we imagined. I walked away convinced I met someone rare, someone aligned with the values my upbringing had drilled into me since childhood. We dated for 3 years before getting married, years I believe were built on transparency and mutual respect. I was 31 when we said our vows. She had just turned 28. Our wedding was modest but warm, held in December with soft lights and familiar faces filling the pews. My mother cried throughout the ceremony, squeezing my hand afterward and telling me how proud she was of the family we were starting. My younger brother stood beside me as my best man, smiling wide, clapping me on the back, calling me lucky. At the time, I thought that word, lucky, summed up my life perfectly. After marriage, our lives settled into what looked like a quiet success. I continued climbing professionally, eventually overseeing multiple distribution routes and managing teams across 3 states. The pressure was intense, but it paid well enough to buy a home in a comfortable neighborhood and plan for the children we said we wanted. My wife transitioned into administrative healthcare work, a role that gave her predictable hours and plenty of flexibility. She often said how grateful she was for the stability I provided, how lucky she felt not to struggle the way some of her friends did. I believed her gratitude was love, and I wore that belief like armor. Family was always at the center of everything we did, or so I thought. Sundays were reserved for dinner at my mother's house. Holidays were sacred, and loyalty to blood was treated as law. My mother had raised us to believe that family protected its own at all costs, that outsiders could never understand the bond we shared. My brother and I were close growing up, or at least close enough that I trusted him without question. I helped him through job losses, loaned him money without paperwork, defended him when others criticized his recklessness. To me, that was what an older brother did: shield, support, sacrifice. Looking back now, I can see the cracks I chose to ignore, the moments that didn't sit right but felt easy to dismiss and confront. The late nights she claimed were work emergencies, the way conversations stopped when I entered a room, the subtle tension I mistook for stress. I told myself marriage required trust, that suspicion was poison, and that love meant believing even when doubt whispered otherwise. I had no idea that while I was busy being dependable, being loyal, and being blind, the people closest to me were rewriting my life behind my back. This story isn't about a single betrayal. It's about layers of deception built carefully over time by people who knew me well enough to exploit my faith in them. It's about how respect can be weaponized, how family loyalty can become a shield for the unforgivable, and how truth is a way of waiting patiently for the worst possible moment to reveal itself. On the surface, I was a man with a stable career, a devoted wife, and a tight-knit family. Underneath that surface, something rotten was already growing, fed by silence and protected by those I trusted most. I didn't know it then, but everything I believed about my marriage, my brother, and my mother was already alive by the time we hung our first Christmas wreath as a married couple. The life I was so proud of was a carefully staged performance, and I was the only one who didn't know the script had changed. Chapter 1 of my story ends with ignorance, with confidence, with a man certain he was safe. What follows is what happens when that certainty is ripped away, not by strangers, but by the very people who taught you what family was supposed to mean. If Chapter 1 was about the man I believed I was, then Chapter 2 is about the slow, almost invisible erosion of that belief. Nothing collapsed all at once. There was no dramatic confession, no screaming match, no single moment I could point to and say, this is where it all went wrong. Instead, the truth crept in quietly, disguised as routine, hiding inside habits I trusted and patterns I refused to question. At the time, I still believed love meant patience and family meant protection. So every warning sign was neatly folded away under the excuse of responsibility and faith. It started with distance, the kind that doesn't announce itself but settles into a marriage like fog. My wife became harder to reach emotionally, though she was still physically present. She laughed less, touched less, and responded to questions with vague reassurances instead of details. When I asked how her day had been, she'd summarize hours into a sentence. When I spoke about work stress, she listened politely but with a distracted look, as though her mind was elsewhere. I told myself this was normal, that marriages went through seasons, and that not every silence was a threat. Around the same time, my brother began showing up more often than usual. He stopped by unannounced, lingered longer during family dinners, and volunteered himself into conversations that didn't concern him. He'd ask my wife how she was doing before he asked me, and I noticed she answered him more openly than she answered me. It didn't strike me as wrong then, just familiarity, just family being close. I had no framework for suspicion because I trusted him completely, and that trust blinded me more effectively than ignorance ever could. My mother, too, began acting differently, though I wouldn't have used that word at the time. She became unusually invested in my marriage, asking pointed questions about our plans, our finances, and whether we were trying for children. She framed her concern as care, reminding me that time moved quickly and that family legacy mattered. When I mentioned small tensions between my wife and me, she dismissed them gently, telling me not to overthink, not to let the devil plant doubt where love lived. I accepted her words as wisdom, never considering they might be strategy. The first moment that truly unsettled me came late one evening when I returned home earlier than expected from a canceled work trip. I walked into a house that felt abruptly quiet, like someone had just left in a hurry. My wife was in the kitchen, startled in a way that didn't match the situation, dropping her phone as if it had burned her. She laughed it off, blamed nerves, and hugged me tightly, almost desperately. I remember standing there, holding her, wondering why something that should have felt comforting felt wrong instead. Over the following weeks, I noticed inconsistencies, stories that didn't quite line up, timelines that shifted slightly when repeated, explanations that sounded rehearsed. My brother suddenly had reasons to call my wife directly, bypassing me altogether, and my mother always seemed to know things before I told her. Each incident alone was harmless, explainable, forgettable. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to name. I told myself I was tired, stressed, imagining things. I had built my life on trust, and I wasn't prepared to dismantle it over intuition. What I didn't understand then was that deception thrives in environments where confrontation is discouraged. Our family valued peace over truth, harmony over honesty. I had been taught that asking too many questions was disrespectful, that doubt signaled weakness, and that loyalty meant silence when things felt uncomfortable. So I stayed silent. I smiled through dinners, prayed to confusion, and convinced myself that love would correct whatever imbalance I sensed. In doing so, I unknowingly became complicit in my own betrayal. By the time the year turned toward December, something inside me had shifted, though I couldn't articulate what it was. I felt like a guest in my own marriage, like a supporting character in scenes where I should have been central. Still, I clung to routine because routine felt safe. Christmas was approaching, and with it came traditions, gatherings, and the illusion of unity. I told myself that the holidays would reconnect us, that shared meals and familiar rituals would restore what felt broken. I had no idea that Christmas Eve wouldn't heal anything. It would expose everything. Looking back now, Chapter 2 wasn't about ignorance anymore. It was about denial. The signs were there, stacked one on top of another, forming a truth I wasn't emotionally equipped to face. I had trusted the wrong people for the right reasons, and that made the betrayal deeper than anger. It made it personal. By the time I stepped into my mother's living room that Christmas Eve, I was already standing on the edge of a reality that would shatter every version of family I had ever known. Christmas Eve had always been sacred in my family, not just a holiday, but a performance of unity we rehearsed every year without question. That night, I arrived at my mother's house carrying gifts and expectations, still convincing myself that whatever tension lingered in my marriage would soften under the glow of tradition. The house smelled like cinnamon and roasted meat, the kind of familiar comfort that usually disarmed me the moment I stepped inside. My brother was already there, laughing too loudly, moving too freely, while my wife hovered near my mother in the kitchen, their heads bent together in a way that felt rehearsed rather than intimate. I told myself I was projecting, that I was letting stress color ordinary moments, because admitting otherwise would mean admitting something I wasn't ready to face. Dinner passed with forced cheer and carefully chosen words, conversation skimming the surface of safety. I noticed how my wife avoided my eyes, how my brother seemed to study my reactions instead of enjoying the meal, and how my mother watched all of us like a conductor keeping tempo. When dessert was cleared, my mother announced she had something special planned, something she said would clear the air and bring peace before the new year. Her tone made my stomach tighten, but I smiled anyway, trained by years of obedience to trust her intentions without question. I had no idea that peace, in her vocabulary, meant control rather than truth. She asked us all to sit in the living room, lights dimmed except for the tree, the ornaments reflecting fractured versions of our faces. Then she handed me a folded piece of paper, thicker than it should have been, her hands trembling just enough to notice. She told me to read it quietly, to take my time, and to remember that family handled things internally. That last sentence echoed in my head as I unfolded the paper and saw the title written at the top, bold and deliberate, like a verdict already decided. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain refused to process them as real, choosing confusion over comprehension. The list wasn't long, but every line felt like a blade. It detailed timelines, meetings, lies told and lies covered, each point stripped of emotion and presented as fact. It stated plainly that my wife was pregnant, that the child wasn't mine, and that my brother was a father. It went further, outlining how my mother had known for months, how she had helped hide appointments, excuse absences, and redirect suspicion. There were dates I recognized, moments I remembered differently, memories now rewritten by context I never had. By the time I reached the bottom, my hands were shaking so badly the paper rattled audibly in the quiet room. I looked up slowly, expecting denial, panic, anything that might signal this was a cool misunderstanding. Instead, I saw resignation. My wife was crying silently, not in shock but in exhaustion, as though she'd been waiting for this moment to arrive. My brother stared at the floor, jaw clenched, while my mother met my eyes with a look that wasn't remorseful but firm. She began speaking before I could, explaining how complicated things were, how mistakes happened, how her priority had been protecting the family from scandal. She said she planned to tell me eventually, when the timing was right, when I was strong enough. Something in me broke then, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I realized that every instinct I'd ignored, every doubt I'd buried, had been screaming the truth all along. This wasn't a single betrayal, but a coordinated effort, sustained by the belief that I would accept whatever version of reality they handed me. They hadn't just lied to me. They had managed me, curated my understanding of my own life. In that moment, anger wasn't my first emotion. Clarity was. A cold, sharp clarity that cut through shock and landed on resolve. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I folded the list carefully and placed it on the table, my movements deliberate, controlled. I thanked my mother for her honesty, which startled her more than rage would have. I told my wife I needed time, which she nodded at as though she'd rehearsed that response. I told my brother nothing at all, because there were no words left worth wasting. Inside, though, Something was shifting, aligning itself with a purpose I hadn't known I was capable of holding. I understood then that silence could be a weapon, just as truth could. That night ended without confrontation, without closure, without resolution. I left my mother's house carrying the weight of knowledge that couldn't be unlearned, the kind that rearranges your past and redraws your future in the same breath. They thought the list was the end of the story, a controlled confession designed to limit damage and preserve appearances. What they didn't understand was that by giving me the truth in writing, they had handed me leverage. Christmas Eve didn't destroy me. It woke me up, and once awake, I began planning what accountability would look like when I decided it was time to stop being managed and start being heard. The days after Christmas Eve passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the kind that feels artificial because everyone involved knows the truth but pretends routine can still function. I returned home with my wife that night, and we moved through the same rooms like strangers sharing a temporary shelter. No arguments erupted, no explanations were demanded, because I had already decided that noise would only save them. They expected emotion, expected confrontation, expected me to break in predictable ways. Instead, I observed, I listened. I let silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, because silence forces people to fill it, and people reveal far more when they believe you aren't paying attention. I began documenting everything, quietly and methodically, the way I handled logistics at work. I wrote down dates, copied messages, saved emails, and cross-referenced timelines against the list my mother had given me. Patterns emerged quickly once I stopped making excuses for them. Doctor appointments aligned with nights I'd been told she was working late. Family gatherings coincided with moments I'd been encouraged to travel for work. Even casual conversations took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of coordination rather than coincidence. It became clear that this wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was an operation sustained by shared interests and mutual secrecy. At home, my wife attempted normalcy with a determination that bordered on desperation. She cooked meals, asked about my day, and spoke about future plans as though nothing fundamental had changed. I played my part convincingly, responding politely, keeping my tone even, never revealing what I was collecting internally. She mistook my calm for forgiveness, my restraint for weakness, and that misunderstanding worked in my favor. Every word she spoke freely, every detail she shared without caution, added another thread to a tapestry she didn't realize I was weaving. My brother, on the other hand, grew uneasy. He called more often, left voicemails that sounded rehearsed, and attempted to position himself as supportive without ever addressing the truth directly. When we did speak, he spoke in generalities, about family, about mistakes, about moving forward. I let him talk. I let him justify himself to the sound of his own voice. People who believe they still have influence tend to confess more than they intend to, especially when they are trying to control outcomes rather than accept consequences. I learned more from his nervous monologues than I ever could have through confrontation. My mother maintained her authority with practiced confidence, calling to check in, reminding me that this situation required discretion. She spoke about reputations, about unborn children, about forgiveness as if it were a favor she could negotiate rather than a choice I had to make. What struck me most wasn't her lack of remorse, but her certainty that she still controlled the narrative. She believed I would prioritize family image over personal truth, because that's how she trained me. What she didn't realize was that training cuts both ways. It had taught me patience, discipline, and how to wait for the right moment. During this time, I consulted a lawyer quietly, not to act immediately but to understand my options. I learned what evidence mattered, what documentation held weight, and how timing could determine outcomes more decisively than emotion ever could. I wasn't interested in revenge fueled by rage. I wanted accountability that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. I wanted a reckoning grounded in facts, one that didn't rely on anyone believing my pain but forced them to acknowledge their actions. Knowledge became my anchor, my way of reclaiming control in a situation designed to strip it from me. As weeks passed, the pregnancy became harder to hide, and tension grew within the family. I could sense them recalculating, adjusting strategies, deciding how long my silence would last. They didn't know that every day they waited made my position stronger. Silence, I learned, isn't absence, it's preparation. It gives you space to see clearly, to detach emotion from decision-making, and to move deliberately instead of reactively. While they worried about exposure, I focused on alignment, making sure every piece was in place before anything moved. By the time January ended, I was no longer the man from Chapter 1, clinging to certainty and trust. I was someone else entirely, someone who understood that loyalty without accountability is manipulation, and that love without truth is performance. I hadn't confronted anyone because I didn't need to. The truth was already doing its wake, tightening around them as options narrowed. They believed they were waiting me out, that eventually I'd accept the version of reality they preferred. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't waiting to forgive. I was waiting to expose. Chapter 4 isn't dramatic, and it isn't loud, but it's where the outcome became inevitable. This was a chapter where I chose strategy over sentiment, clarity over comfort, and patience over impulse. Everything that followed was built on this foundation of silence, documentation, and resolve. By the time they realized my quiet wasn't compliance, it would be too late to rewrite the story again. By the time spring arrived, I understood something that took me years of living to learn. People who build their lives on secrecy grow careless once they believe the danger has passed. My continued silence had convinced them that Christmas Eve had been the climax rather than the beginning. They thought the list had broken me, that knowledge without resistance meant surrender. What it actually did was give me room to move without interference. I watched their guard drop slowly, almost lazily, as weeks passed with no explosion, no public fallout, no consequences they could point to. Comfort returned to them, and comfort makes people sloppy. My wife stopped pretending as carefully as she once had. She spoke more openly about the pregnancy, not to me directly, but in ways meant to test the air, gauging whether the subject still carried danger. She mentioned appointments casually, complained about discomfort, and even asked logistical questions that assumed my cooperation. Each time she spoke, she revealed how deeply she misunderstood the silence she mistook for acceptance. I responded with neutral acknowledgement, never correcting her assumptions, never interrupting the illusion she relied on to feel safe. Inside, I catalogued everything, aware that her comfort was the most valuable evidence she could give me. My brother, emboldened by the absence of consequences, began trying to reclaim space in my life. He invited me to lunch, asked for advice, spoke about future plans as if betrayal were a temporary misunderstanding rather than a permanent fracture. He even referenced the unborn child once, framing it as something that would eventually bring the family closer. That sentence alone told me everything I needed to know about how he justified himself. He didn't see the betrayal as theft. He saw it as redistribution, something he felt entitled to because no one had stopped him soon enough. My mother's confidence, however, was the most dangerous thing to witness. She moved through family gatherings with renewed authority, speaking about unity, forgiveness, and new beginnings as though she had successfully contained a crisis rather than orchestrated it. She believed she had managed me the way she always had, through appeals to duty and emotional restraint. When she spoke about the future, she did so without consulting me, already planning narratives where I played a role I had never agreed to. Watching her operate with such certainty clarified something painful but necessary. She never intended to protect me, only the image of the family she controlled. The turning point came when I realized exposure didn't need to be dramatic to be devastating. It needed to be precise. I began quietly correcting records, informing key people not with accusations but with verifiable facts presented calmly and without emotion. A lawyer, a trusted family friend, a supervisor who needed context before rumors could reach him first. Each conversation was deliberate, stripped of embellishment, grounded in documentation. I didn't ask for sympathy, and I didn't seek validation. I simply placed the truth where it could no longer be ignored or reshaped. The effect was subtle at first, then exponential. Conversations shifted. Invitations changed tone. Questions began circulating without answers ready to contain them. My wife noticed before the others did, sensing the change in how people looked at her, how pauses lingered longer than they should have. My brother became defensive, quicker to justify, quicker to explain things no one had asked him to explain. My mother, for the first time, seemed uncertain, her usual confidence replaced by calculation as she realized the narrative was slipping beyond her reach. What surprised me most wasn't their reaction to the truth, but their reaction to my composure. They expected anger, expected emotional collapse, expected something they could label as instability. Instead, they faced consistency. Every question I answered the same way, every fact aligned, every timeline held. There were no contradictions to exploit, no emotional outbursts to discredit. I had removed myself from the story as a victim and repositioned myself as a witness. That shift changed everything. When the confrontation finally came, it wasn't explosive. It was desperate. My wife accused me of betrayal for telling our business to outsiders. My brother accused me of cruelty for refusing to protect him. My mother accused me of tearing the family apart for refusing to stay silent. Listening to them, I realized they all shared the same belief, that truth belonged to them, and I was merely a custodian until they decided how it should be used. Saying nothing in response felt more powerful than any argument I could have made. Chapter 5 is where the illusion finally cracked, not because I shattered it violently, but because I stopped holding it together. The truth doesn't need force when it's supported by patience and clarity. It only needs space. By the end of this chapter, they understood something they had never considered before, that I was no longer participating in the version of reality they had designed. I wasn't asking for permission, forgiveness, or understanding. I was letting consequences take shape naturally, knowing the final chapter would belong not to their justifications, but to what remained when those justifications could no longer stand. There's a particular kind of calm that comes when you know the worst has already happened, and the rest is just accounting. By the time the next Christmas season approached, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns hot and fast, but clarity is cold and enduring. I had moved out quietly months earlier, citing space and reflection, leaving behind a marriage that existed only on paper and habit. The divorce paperwork was already in motion, guided by facts rather than fury. I didn't rush anything, because rushing would have given them time to adjust. Instead, I waited, letting the weight of truth settle into every corner of their lives, heavy enough to bend outcomes without me having to push. What none of them realized was that I had chosen Christmas again on purpose. Not for nostalgia, not for tradition, but for symmetry. The first Christmas Eve had been when they handed me the truth in a controlled environment, believing they could decide how much damage it would do. The second Christmas Eve would be when I removed that control completely. I didn't announce anything ahead of time. I accepted my mother's invitation with the same calm tone I'd used all year, confirming attendance as if nothing monumental was about to happen. That calm reassured her more than any promise ever could. The living room looked almost identical to the year before, decorated with the same ornaments, the same tree, the same forced warmth. Familiarity can be dangerous when people mistake it for safety. Family friends were present this time, distant relatives too, people whose opinions mattered more than my silence ever had. My wife was visibly pregnant now, my brother hovering near her with a protectiveness that would have looked noble if it weren't rooted in theft. My mother moved through the room like a hostess performing normalcy, confident that whatever damage existed had already been contained. After dinner, when everyone settled in with drinks and conversation slowed, I stood up without raising my voice. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't frame it as a confrontation. I simply said I needed a moment to clarify something before the year ended. That word, clarify, shifted the air immediately. I spoke slowly, deliberately, introducing myself the same way I always had, as Wesley Carver, husband, brother, son. Then I explained that I wouldn't be those things anymore, at least not in the way they understood, because those roles had been built on lies that no longer existed. I laid out the truth plainly, without embellishment or accusation. I referenced timelines, facts, and decisions already documented. I explained that the pregnancy wasn't a betrayal, deception was. That secrecy wasn't protection, it was manipulation. That silence wasn't peace, it was consent, and I was withdrawing mine. I didn't look at my wife when I spoke. I didn't need to. I looked at the room, at the witnesses, at the people who would carry this truth beyond that house no matter how hard my mother tried to contain it. The story no longer belonged to her. The reactions were exactly what you'd expect when control collapses publicly. My wife cried. My brother protested. My mother tried to speak over me, to interrupt, to soften words he could no longer edit. But something had changed fundamentally. No one was looking to them for cues anymore. Eyes were on me, Not because I was louder, but because I was clearer. When I finished, I didn't ask for understanding or forgiveness. I wished everyone a peaceful holiday and sat back down, the room buzzing with a truth that could no longer be folded neatly away. I left shortly after, not in anger, not in triumph, but in completion. Outside, the air was cold and sharp, grounding in a way that felt earned. I understood then that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes it's about exposure, about refusing to carry other people's secrets when they cost you your dignity. I didn't need them to suffer dramatically. I needed them to live with the reality of what they'd done without my silence cushioning the impact. In the months that followed, consequences unfolded naturally. Relationships strained, reputations shifted, and narratives fractured under scrutiny. I didn't monitor it closely because my life had already begun moving forward. I focused on rebuilding something honest, something that didn't require denial to survive. I learned that peace doesn't come from keeping families together at any cost. It comes from refusing to sacrifice yourself for illusions that benefit everyone but you. This story ends without reconciliation, without forgiveness scenes, without dramatic apologies. It ends with autonomy, with a man who was once managed, controlled, and underestimated, choosing truth over tradition and clarity over comfort. They handed me a list once, believing it would limit damage. What they didn't understand was that lists can be shared, stories can be corrected, and silence can end. Christmas came again, and this time, I didn't bring gifts. I brought the truth, and then I walked away with my life intact. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and leave a comment letting me know what you thought. And if you're not already subscribed, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.